Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Outdoor Adventure Series podcast, where we celebrate individuals and families, businesses, and organizations that seek out and promote the exploration, stewardship, conservation, access, and enjoyment of the outdoors. Bruce McLellan is our guest on the Outdoor Adventure Series today. Bruce is a grizzly bear research scientist who retired after 43 years studying bears in the Flathead drainage just north of Glacier National Park and 3 other areas in southern British Columbia. He is also the author of the soon-to-be-published book, Grizzly Bear Science and the Art of a Wilderness Life, 40 Years of Research in the Flathead Valley. Bruce, it's a pleasure to have you on the Outdoor Adventure Series podcast, and I look forward to learning more about you and your work. Welcome.
Hey, thank you. It's pleasure to be here.
Fantastic. And I would have to, first off, congratulations, you're retired. I don't think I'm ever going to be able to retire, but 43 years studying bears and the grizzlies in beautiful areas of Canada, that is quite the career.
It has been. It's looking back at it, it's very unique, and it's been a lot of good moments, like all good moments. And I must say, I'm retired from my paid job, and I'm certainly not retired from being involved with grizzly bear conservation and even research. I'm still active, but not as active, of course, as I was 5 years ago.
Excellent. So you get to decide whether you want to get up early or sleep in a little bit in the morning.
I wish I could. I just can't sleep in anymore. That's kind of a brag about turning 70. As the years when you wanted to sleep in, you couldn't. And now that I'd like to sleep in, I can. So anyway.
I don't know. I'm getting up there as well, but not there yet. But it's just that's a good point. So what I definitely want to talk about the book, but I'd love if you could share with our listeners a little bit more about your background. How did you come to decide this was going to be my career? I mean, again, we're going back 40 some years, but just give us the high level.
For that decision, it's a lot more than 47 years. I mean, that goes back to childhood.
Okay.
I think you and probably a lot of youngsters are really keen on animals. I mean, it's something I think innate in humanity, and I was into. I had pets of it. You name every small rodent, I had them as pets, and different lizards and all those things when I was a kid. And I just had that interest. And boy, when I went to college, I wanted to be a wildlife biologist. That was my passion. And also I got into kind of wildernessy things. I spent a lot of my youth on the mountains, and my parents had an old cabin way back in the mountains, and we used to kind of use it as a base to head off into the wilderness. So I had this kind of a combined passion for wildlife and for wilderness, and so I ended up becoming a wildlife biologist. I never thought of being anything else, actually.
That's actually wonderful. And, we have these moments in our lives, especially in youth, that are transformative. And sometimes we know about it, sometimes we don't. What I'm hearing is, you grew up around nature. You had parents that were supportive of you and perhaps and your siblings, and just to get out and explore. And I'm curious. I mean, it doesn't sound like that. I'm going to take a guess. You didn't grow up in a big city, did you? Or were you in a big city and you just had the cabin? How did that connection come about?
I grew up on the edge of North Vancouver, Vancouver, but right on the edge of the mountain. But my father was an engineer that designed ski lifts and things like that. So we spent a lot of time in Lake Louise in the 1950s. I saw my first grizzly bear there when I was like 4 years old, right in Banff National Park. We actually spent quite a bit of time in Jackson Hole. He designed the big tramway that used to be there and the chairlifts there. So we lived in North Van. We had the cabin on the mountain right behind the mountain. So we spent a lot of time in the forest back up there. Plus we lived in, short term, like 2 months and 3 months in all kinds of other mountainous areas, ski resort areas, and ski resort areas in the 50s and 60s aren't quite like they are today. I mean, even Jackson Hole was a pretty wild place in 1965 or whenever the 60s when we were there. So I lived in the city, but had ample opportunity to not spend time in it. I mean, the edge
I
of
love that.
was not a city back then.
I can imagine. And I loved that because I could imagine. I mean, it truly was the wild. I don't want to say Wild West. I live in the Wild West in Las Vegas, but what you have today is a lot different way back in the 50s. Where did you decide to go to school?
Well, I went to UBC, University of British Columbia in Vancouver, because I lived in Vancouver, and
Okay,
smart. Yeah, I could live in my first 2 years. I could live with my parents until we kind of grew up, and it's hard to live with your parents when you become 20. When you're a teenager, you still could, because
right.
mom would make me food and things like that. But I did be 20 years old, and then I moved out. But
Yeah.
a bunch of other youngsters had a lot of fun. But I ended up going to UBC, and also UBC at that time, and probably still was at that time was probably the best university in the world for large mammal ecology or ecology. There was some amazing professors there that are kind of the foundation of a lot of our ecological knowledge. I could drop some names if you want, but most people will know that in the 70s and 80s that UBC had some really big names in ecology.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you what, after our recording ends, if you want to share an email with some of those names, and definitely I'd love to be able to include those in the show notes, and whether they're still with us or that they're legends and in the past.
I could rattle off some real quick if you want.
Okay, let's do it. Let's go wild. Let's do it.
There's Charlie Krebs, who's written many textbooks on ecology. Tony Sinclair, who is a major African researcher. There was Buzz Halling, who was really well known in the world of ecology. He's passed away. Who else? Carl Walters. I mean, it was Fred Bunnell. It was a pretty hot spot for ecological research then. It probably still is.
Okay.
Although those are major names in ecology. Those guys.
Excellent. Well, we'll definitely follow up with this to get our spellings correct, and if we can find some links out on the internet, we'll post those too. Now, of all the years now of studying the grizzly bear, I mean, I've seen grizzly bears at the zoo. I've watched my friend, Chris, and you and I were just chatting about before the call started. She's done documentaries, so I get to see some of her work. But what was it about the grizzly bear research that really struck a chord for you and motivated you to want to make a career of this?
Well, I didn't start with grizzly bears. I wanted to just become a wildlife biologist. Actually, we started on elk.
Okay.
And I use the word we because my wife was a major player, unpaid player on all my research projects because she just liked living in the bush.
I want to talk about that. I mean, you lucked out there, my friend.
But so we started on elk, and then I did a bit on mountain goats, and then it was grizzly bears were just the next animal that kind of rolled along out of what could have been done. And but it didn't take too long before I realized that they were a pretty special and fascinating animal to work with. For example, I was doing a bit of work on deer in the winters when bears were hibernating just to make some money to get through grad school. And we had a bunch of radio-collared deer in this hillside. And one evening I was out there watching the deer with my wife. And after about 5 minutes of staring at deer on a hillside, she says, "Deer sure are boring compared to grizzly bears, aren't they?" And for some reason, sitting there watching a grizzly bear at 100 yards on a hillside is fascinating. But watching a deer 100 yards on a hillside, she got bored pretty quick. It's just, there's something about them that I think innately stimulates something deep down. They're a very large carnivore, and humans have and all animals probably have some kind of a special relationship with very large, powerful animals.
What if you could help unpack that a little bit? What makes the grizzly special in from your perspective?
Uh, well, it's a physically pretty spectacular looking animal in that it's got a nice colorage. Uh, there's an attitude about it that is something that is different than, say, a black bear, and well, it's quite a bit a larger bear. It's rare, and rarity is also something that I think people find make a bit more interesting. But there's the stature about them, and of course there's this kind of mystical, almost behavior that they can turn quickly, and if we don't treat them right and or surprise them at a close up, very close, and you can get a reaction that's very, very powerful. And
Yeah.
so there's things about that make them pretty special. You know that you're possibly no longer at the top of the food chain when you're in their presence.
Okay.
And something kind of, I felt that in, places in Asia where there's tigers around too. You just kind of, not that I've spent much time there at all, but it's just something that is a little bit different than our day-to-day life.
Okay. And as you began your research, how did that evolve? And this is probably a multi-part question. And I'll try to check out the breadcrumbs here, but there's a lot in 40 some years of studying these animals. You have their presence in the wild. Um, I'm curious about their conservation and is the population stable? Is it growing? I mean, humans, I mean, like you say, you lived in Vancouver, north part of Vancouver. The cities, the sprawl of the urban sprawl is there, it's apparent. And so how has your research with the bear one evolved, and what is the state of the grizzly bear population, at least in the area where you were doing your research?
That is a long and complex question. When I started, I was 24 years old. It was 1978. They had been just listed as an endangered species in the lower 48,
Mhm.
whatever that is, in 1975, a few years before. Their numbers, they were listed because their numbers had been greatly depressed, obviously, in the lower 48. They once were across much of the western half of your country, and in whatever 100 years they've been eradicated from almost the entire place. They're only found in around Yellowstone and in around Glacier National Park, and in British Columbia and Alberta a very similar trend had happened. The people were virtually the same. The settlers that came into the lower 48, including all the 49ers in California, gold rush people, a lot of them moved north in 1858 when gold was found in British Columbia. Really, the same type of people, obviously, were coming to were coming into British Columbia and Alberta as we're in the lower 48, and they were acting the same way, and they reduced our bear numbers a lot too. And 75, the listing of bears in the lower 48 also had big effects in Canada because uh, people realized that things may be not doing well for bears here as well. So management, as well as human attitudes towards them, changed. And of course, it was relatively easy to change human attitudes when they were rare. So when I started to my work, they were not real rare, like they weren't extinct at all, but numbers were relatively low. And in the first 20 years that I worked on, through the 80s and 90s, the population where I was working went up quite a bit. It went up almost tripled. And areas that had not had bears for a long time, like around towns and things, were gradually starting to see more and more. And that trend is continuing throughout southern British Columbia, except for two or three populations we have in the southern coast mountains. And those populations are isolated and small and doing poorly still. But most of the southern British Columbia populations have expanded over the last whatever, 20, 30, 40 years. So, and that's the same trend, of course, that's happened in Yellowstone and the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem around Glacier National Park. Their populations have, tripled or more, and similar things has happened in southern British Columbia.
Okay. I'm curious, what are some of the data points that you're collecting in your research, and how does that inform our behaviors as we're humans, as because we're apex predators as well.
Yep.
We
Yep.
want things the way we want them, and sometimes we don't appreciate things until they're gone. So what was some of the data that you're collecting, and how did that inform some of the changes that have taken place in the conservation and management of the grizzly bear and health, for that matter, of the grizzly bear population?
I think a major input I think my personal research may have had a couple. It was I wrote a paper published in 1988, which is a long time ago, on roads and access and the implications of the growing road network on grizzly bears, and particularly their mortality when they die. Once a grizzly bear gets to be about 2 years of age and leaves its mother, about 85% of their deaths is caused by people, even in places where they're not hunted. So being killed by a person is how most grizzly bears, that's at least in the areas where there's people and bears mix. If you go up in the northern Alaska or northern Yukon, it's a little different. But in the southern half of British Columbia and throughout all of the lower 48 states, that's how animals die, the grizzly bears. And most often, almost always, they're killed near a road. And so
Okay.
the effects of access and where the roads are, like in certain area habitats that are very preferred by bears, have issues and problems. And we've worked with people that kind of manage access in a way that has not reduced their ability to get out into the forest, but it has to certain places where grizzly bear encounters would be much more frequent. So that's one. The other part of my research that I know it has changed the way we understand these animals, is that in the 1990s, I was working not in the Flathead, but just north of there on another project, as well as keeping the Flathead going. And that's when we kind of first designed the hair trapping method to estimate bear numbers. And once we did that, more or less the world changed of how people estimate bear and many other animal numbers, because we developed a good marker that would mark an animal, its DNA for life, and not get any mistakes. So that was something that came out of the work I was involved with that did change the way we manage and understand bears and many other species. What other things? It's hard to say. An interesting thing about doing research for that long is that I've published lots and lots of journal papers. I've given lots and lots of public presentations. So a lot of things that changed happened gradually, and I don't even know if I was involved or not. But a lot has changed, and I think a lot of the information we and others, together gained has enabled that change. But it's hard to actually pinpoint exactly that this caused that. It's kind of a gradual thing over 40 some odd years.
It kind of reminds me of this analogy of the frog in the big pot of water. If you put it in when it's boiling, it'll jump right out. But if you put it in when it's cold and you slowly build up the heat, it's not going to know what's going to happen. And so it's very much like the research. It's, the accumulation of all those years of studying and research, impact is taking place, but it's hard to appreciate, when and where that insight took place. And so I love that. I'm curious if you wouldn't mind going just a little deeper on capturing the hair follicles and studying the DNA. I have an idea of how this works. I think I took 2 biology courses in my entire career, but I read a lot and I talk to a lot of people. Tell us a little bit more about what you're finding in the with the hair and how it's translating to what we know more about the grizzly population today, because I think that'd be very interesting to know.
Yeah, okay. Originally, we used it to estimate numbers of bears. Now, to a lot of people, they might think or not even think about how do you go about counting bears? And it's very difficult in a forested area like the southern half of the continent where they live. Is they have big ranges. They look different. They don't have individual markings like tigers or whales. They're hard to tell apart as they travel over, 1,000+ square kilometers or miles even. So counting them was always a huge challenge, and nobody had really figured out how to do it very well in forested areas where you can't see them. So we were working originally with cameras. These are not modern cameras. These are film cameras that some guys developed in Montana, and trying to get ratios of known numbers of collared animals to uncollared animals by the cameras. Because that if you get those ratios right, if you know how many collared animals you have, then you can estimate total population size. But we were having a lot of problems with those old film cameras, as you can imagine. And then I was talking to a young geneticist at the time, he's not young anymore, about how to get DNA out of cubs, because with black bears, we were trying to figure out who the dads were. We knew who the moms were, but we knew that at that point with the DNA, we could also figure out the fathers. And I was asking him how to get DNA out of a black bear cub out of the den. I mean, these things are only about 5 pounds. They're smaller than a brand new baby, most brand new human babies. And it was hard to get. We used to get DNA out of adult bears with blood or an actual tissue sample. And I asked him, and that was in 1995, and he said, oh, for about 2 years, we've been able to get DNA out of the roots of the hair. And that was the aha moment.
Wow.
Wow, that changes the world. And so I talked to my partner in that project, John Woods, and we got a new student who was keen on helping, Mike Proctor, and he came on board. And we kind of worked with a guy called Dave Lewis, who was a bit of a cowboy and knew about barbed wire. So next thing, we all knew about barbed wire. We didn't put it together. That was the best way to get hair. So anyway, from that, we set out these grids across large areas, and we could get this ratio of caught, newly caught, a history of individuals, like sample session 1, individual was caught, session 2, not caught, not caught, caught, not caught, as time goes on. And from that, we can estimate ratios, and not only abundance of animals, but also population trends if we do it long enough over years, because you get individuals falling out and you get new individuals coming in, and there's probabilities that they've been before, and you can calculate all that stuff. And so you can estimate density and trend, and which is density actually was really improved over the last 20 years because of mathematical sort of guys. One guy in New Zealand, Murray Effort, and Andy Royal in the US, both were getting these spatial models of capture, recapture, and using their brains and our brawn, we could kind of figure out densities and didn't have to deal with this problem of bears moving in and out of our census areas as much. But also from the DNA, you get relatedness. You can understand who's the mother and who's the father of individuals, and also gene flow, like how different populations are from one another, and look at the importance of historical fractures there. And with hair, you can also get what we call isotopes of different elements. So we can look at what is it, not exactly what's in the diet as to the individual species, but we can get the trophic level of where the foods that built the hairs came from, because there's different isotopes in nitrogen and carbon and sulfur and a bunch of other elements. So you get an awful lot out of hair. And I'm not even going to go into the more modern things people are getting out of DNA. They can look at past histories of the species and look at bottlenecks that they've probably gone through and all this stuff. It's because I can't keep up with these geneticists on all the knowledge they can glean out of a genome. It's it's reshaped what we understand of our own prehistory and all the other species. So it's an amazing tool.
I think it is really amazing is I think putting it light, just the ability to check on the numbers, the counts, the health, the variability of the pool, and
Yep.
and also the migration patterns, and then some. And it's just, yeah, I remember along many years ago when they were first doing the gene splicing and looking at the DNA, and when the computers caught up to the ability to take in all that data and do something with it. I mean, it's case in point. It's impacted your profession. What you could do 40 some years ago is a lot different now today because of the use of technology and other skills.
Absolutely, technology has really changed over my career, and actually, it was something I never even thought of when I actually sat down to write the book. But a university prof, or that really wise university prof out of University of Alberta, who actually reviewed the book, that was one of his comments. Andy DeRoche, a polar bear biologist, he said it's a good history of our technological advances over 45 years on understanding. When I began, the cutting edge technology were now radio collars that actually kind of work. The old VHF ones that you had to go out and find yourself on the ground or from an airplane. And they had just become fairly reliable up to that point, that they were kind of, they didn't really work all that time. And the Craigheads actually were the first to put those together in Yellowstone in the early in the 60s, but they weren't that reliable until the 70s. And so when I started, that was kind of cutting edge. But of course, as I was saying, we were using 35 millimeter film cameras. That's obviously been replaced. Then radio collars have been replaced by GPS collars that over time have got better and better and better. And now I can look at data on my computer screen. I mean, you don't even have to go outside anymore to be a wildlife biologist, which I find sad. This is,
Yeah.
There's
you are probably in very good shape, by the way, just getting out there in the field.
Every day we had to go and find bears. I for 12, 15 years when we lived in the Flathead, that's in the forest down there, I never took a day off. We hiked following bears every single day from April till November till they hibernated, and you learn a lot about bears by watching them and being there with them, and that kind of stuff you're not going to learn anymore because you're just getting dots on a computer screen. But so it's wonderful today, but I think the next generation of biologists are missing out on not only a lot of fun, but a lot of knowledge you get in what I call more traditional knowledge way. Like a lot we've learned about plants and animals has been just by observing them, and
Right.
Which people have been doing since people were people. And before that, I mean, that's how I'm sure other animals learn about things. So, and that's sort of sad to me that that's not as common for a younger biologist as it was for me, who
Right.
spent years out there.
That's amazing. I want to shift if we can, and I definitely want to get further into the book. But you had mentioned at the or started our conversation, your wife has been with you nearly since the beginning, and I was reading this cabin. It's up in the mountains. It's isolated. You're raising a family. How does that come about? I can't even fathom that. I'm an urban guy.
Well, my wife now, I mean, she's been my wife for 40 some odd years, but she was my girlfriend back then. I mean, we started kind of traveling together when we were 20 years old. We did some trips, hitchhiked all over your country and through Mexico one year. And another year we met some buddies and we bought a van in Scotland, and we drove through the Sahara Desert and ended up down in Nigeria and whatnot. And so we were young, we were in 20, and she's a country girl. She's a French Canadian girl who grew up on a small rural dairy farm. I mean, her dad didn't have a car till she was 11 years old. I mean, they have horses and stuff and tractors. So she doesn't like cities. In fact,
Okay.
her sister, she got many sisters. She's got 7 sisters. They tell me that when Montreal Expo went on in '67, she went to Montreal, she would get sick. She
Oh,
couldn't
wow.
she couldn't take the pollution, and she would literally get sick. So she doesn't, she's not like that anymore, but she certainly doesn't like cities. She doesn't.
Right.
She can go years without going in one. She likes the country, and so we just continued from our traveling together to go up and do this elk study, and it was just sort of like what we did. We kind of lived together, worked together. She didn't get paid, but when you live out in the bush, there's nowhere to spend money anyway. So
Right.
it wasn't like we needed piles. And then the next thing we know, we did the bear study and moved down into the Flathead. And it wasn't even, we never had a discussion on whether or not she wanted to come along or not, or whether we were going to live in town and drive in. It was 2-hour drive to our camp. I mean, you couldn't do that every day from
Right.
the nearest town. So I don't know. We never even discussed it. It was kind of like obvious that that's what we were going to do. We were going to move down there and study bears and live
Yeah.
in a whatever we could build.
Very good. Now you've raised a family
Yeah.
there as well.
Oh yeah. No, they were, that was one thing that Celine, that my wife is very family orientated. She's an unbelievably amazing person with young people, and everyone knows that. She's kind of like the baby whisperer. She loves Brookit and all the way through. And so it was kind of there was no question that we were going to have a family. That was not part of it. That was obvious. And we did. And, that was a bit of interesting times because we were in our 20s, and we were living a long way from anywhere. We were, as I say, 2 hours of dirt road to the town. And I don't know, things worked out. I mean, looking back on it, it was kind of pretty dumb because we didn't know anything about childbirth. I didn't know anything. I was 25 years old. So, gee, I mean, we didn't know anything. And it just happened to work out that we were in town on supply runs when the action happened for both kids. And we go out for 2 weeks, go out for a day or two, and then come back in with our supplies. And it just happened that we were out. We didn't have to rush out for any reason. And then we came back in the bush with our babies, whatever, a couple of days later. So it's, and I don't know, it seemed to work quite well. I mean, it wasn't utopic. I mean, there was a billion mosquitoes around there in the summers, and there's stuff in the bush that aren't always wonderful.
Right.
But from my point of view, it was wonderful, and I think for her too. Although once in a while she does say, "Well, it wasn't that perfect," and she talks about the mosquitoes and being stormed in the bad weather for a couple of weeks on end with 2 kids in a little cabin. But all in all, it's all right.
Yeah. I can see you looking at her. She's going, yeah, it was all right.
Well, she just walked in the door, you see.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. So I'm curious to have your children, did they follow in your footsteps?
Yeah, absolutely. 100%, pretty well. Not steady. Like they waffled around a little bit more when they weren't like committed to become wildlife biologists from day one, but both of them are. My daughter did her PhD on grizzly bears, and now she works with grizzly bears and caribou. I also worked with caribou, and so she said you can't get a lot closer. She has 2 kids, so she's a little more constrained to be out doing stuff. My son did his master's degree on grizzly bears in Banff Park, and he works for Parks Canada as a biologist there. So they kind of ended up doing it. I mean, I just spent time hunting with them, camped out in our tents, and it was kind of neat. They're in their 40s now, right? To be with both kids. And also a guy was along, Rob Soroya, who was a PhD student of mine years and years ago. He was with us too. So he's almost like not my child, but he's kind of like the guy. I'm a kind of a mentor to him. So it's neat to have all 3 of them there.
I love it.
My son he's quite a hunter. He's very observant and amazing. He's good up there.
I love it. Now, I am curious, have you and your children collaborated on work together, producing some body of work?
Yes, yeah, my daughter and I ended up doing a project together in the Coast Mountains, right where I am now, living
Okay.
for 15 years. We kind of worked. It just kind of evolved that way. She Before that, it wasn't full on nepotism. I didn't get her the job, but she had got a job as a bear viewing guide, on the coast in British Columbia at salmon spawning streams. She had another job for Parks Canada, working as a bear traffic jam, bear jam sort of person that deals with issues around wildlife. She had worked for a while in Alberta on grizzly bear research, so she had quite a bit of grizzly bear experience. And a committee that didn't include me hired her to do this bear project on the coast, and all they wanted me to do is catch the bears. So I came out because I put radio collars on an awful lot of bears in my life. So I came out and radio collared all these bears, and about the same. And then she got the job to follow the bears to actually find out. These were GPS collars, but was hired to go out there to the points and know what the bears were doing there. And as time went on, she sort of took over the project, and I became her technician, kind of helper,
Okay.
because she is much more analytical than I am. She's
Gotcha.
smarter, and she's better with modern GIS and statistical analyses than I want to be. She's good at it. I'm
I
not.
love it. I love it. It's interesting. One of your first stories that you shared was you. And again, I don't recall your wife at the time or your girlfriend when you were watching the elk, and she says the grizzlies are more interesting. So her keen observation, her awareness of
Yeah.
how interesting this is, and now that's what your daughter's doing, is the observational aspects of it. So I thought that's a really cool connection right there. So Bruce, what I love to do now is kind of, I feel like we've been laying the groundwork for your book, Grizzly Bear Science and the Art of a Wilderness Life. What was this moment, that aha moment is what I would call it, when you said, gee, I think I need to write a book? I mean, because some people, they're born writers. I mean, as a an academic, a researcher, you're used to writing papers, but when did this idea of that, gee, I want to write a book about my life and my work, and just this intersection between the science and just the reality of raising a family out in the wilderness?
It wasn't an aha moment. It wasn't one moment. I mean, it gradually grew on me. Steve Herrero, who's written a book on bear attacks, an elderly professor into grizzly bear work, several times over the last 20 or 30 years said, you got to write this up in a book form. And but another thing that affected me was that ultimately, one way or another, I mean, the work, all my research has been funded by the taxpayer in Canada, and some of the US taxpayers even. And I kind of felt that it was almost not fair that I would just write up in these science journals that nobody ever reads, not except other scientists.
Mhm.
And people don't even know what we do. So I thought I should summarize everything in a format that other people can read. I mean, the people that actually funded this stuff. I mean, I got a lot of money from private groups and industry, but that's all could be tax deductible. So somehow or another, the taxpayers did put up the money for all this work. So I thought, again, it was a sort of my duty to do that. And because a lot of people are interested. I mean, the average people I bump into, around the forest or even not, seem to be about as interested in grizzly bears as the researchers are. I mean, they're fascinated in these animals. So I thought that's one reason. But the other was, doing grizzly bear research for that much time is a pretty full on activity. It's not like a 9 to 5 job. You kind of live and breathe this stuff. And when I retired at 65, I didn't feel old. I mean, I'm 70 now. I don't feel old. I've still got lots of energy. So it wasn't like I could stop. So I thought, well, this is a good way just to pull everything together in a format so I feel good that my career has actually gone out to others. and people can kind of see what I learned over all those years. So those are the main reasons I did it, and I put it in the stories about our life and our raising our kids. So I put that in because I thought just another chapter after chapter after chapter of grizzly bear science might get overwhelming for some people. So I wanted to break it up. Plus, I think our story was kind of unique. There's probably others, but I don't know of any other biologists who went out and built a cabin and had babies and raised them in the bush, studied an animal for a long time. I think it might be somewhat unique. So why not put a bit of a unique story together for people to perhaps enjoy if I can write.
Is there a story or two as you're writing this book, and it's either like, wow, that was fun, or that was interesting, or God, I can't believe I did that? Any type of stories like that?
Actually, the very last concluding story in the book, I don't know whether I should put it in. My wife didn't really read it until after the book was out, and I didn't know this happened. And it happened after the book was almost finished. Like, this event happened 2 years after I'd retired. But it was, so I wrote it fresh, like within 2 weeks of it happening. So it was still imprinted big on me. And it was quite an event, actually. It was a bear that was half drugged, and it was like, I was hiding, and it was like, I don't know, less than 10 feet from me.
Oh, wow.
So it worked out fine, but anyway, I don't know if I should have put it in or not, just because it may make it sound too crazy, but it's just, you catch hundreds and hundreds of bears in different ways, and the odd little event comes up. So that's one. And there's lots of little stories that I kind of think of that were interesting and aren't in it, like lots. But so I had to I didn't want to have it overwhelming with bear stories. I could write bear stories for days, but I wanted some in there, but not too many. So those are a couple of things in it that are not in it or not in it that I have thought about.
Okay. I'm curious, with your family and their involvement in writing and kind of perhaps doing some of the reviews of the book, I would imagine this documenting this also served to help bring them closer.
My kids never saw it until it was finished.
Oh, really? Wow.
That I know of. They might have seen bits of it, or I know my son, he doesn't read stuff on the computer screen until it was in print. When it was just like a PDF or something, he wasn't going to read all of it. I think he read bits of it. My wife did once. She's also not a PDF reader.
Okay.
Our daughter bought us a little kind of a digital, what do they call like a little book reader, ebook reader,
like Kindle or something like that. Yeah.
And she can't read those things. She won't pick it up. So they did read it, but they never really reviewed it. Or I know that because now that it's finished, Celine has read it, and she's kind of debated the details of the discussions that there's communication in this book. I wanted to make it somewhat real. So, I mean, there's conversation, right? Well, the conversations that happened 40 years ago may not exactly be what was said. I was trying to put our characters in something that we probably said close to, and she said, I didn't say that.
A little artistic license.
And then she changed it maybe slightly, so it's irrelevant, the difference. So they have had some input, but and I mentioned that some of the non-bear science stuff that there's perhaps some not exactly, it all happened, but it might not happen exactly at the same time in the same place. It might have been this happened after that or something. So so she commented on that because our memories of 40 years ago aren't identical.
Yeah, there you go. So now that the book is out, it's going to be published officially. I believe it's in November. We'll have a link back to the book. What's going to be, I mean, two questions I'm curious about. One is, what's going to be next for you guys, the family? And now that you're retired, you're still active, which is, fantastic. You've got the book. Any other special projects on the horizon for you?
Well, every winter which is the reason I retired. We pull a little trailer down to Mexico and hang out in a very remote spot. And I'm into free diving quite a bit.
Okay.
So we'll be leaving about the same time this book comes out. And of
Okay.
course, there's no internet, there's no electricity, there's nothing where we go. And there's just ocean and fish under the water and whales and stuff. So I won't be back till March, and then then we'll see. Nothing. There's no plan or any change in life. It's
All
just
right.
chugging along.
Okay.
I'm happy it's done, and I hope people find it interesting, and I feel deep down good that most of what I've learned is now in a format that people can see and learn from. I'm happy with that.
I love it. I love it. I've got two more questions. One is, given your body of research and now even extending into your kids, do you have hope, continued hope, growing hope for the grizzly bear population, at least in your area of influence?
I do. We're obviously going to have increasing challenges. The whole climate issue is in front of us and approaching fast, and issues around even climate refugees. What's going to happen? I mean, we living in British Columbia and people in Montana and whatnot. I mean, it's a pretty nice place to live, at least with my value system. And I sort of worry about people further south, including your own country. I mean, Arizona. I mean, I was looking at temperatures last year in Southern California near the Mexicali border, and it was 50 degrees centigrade, which is, I don't know what it is, like 120 for days. I mean, is that livable? If that continues to increase, I suspect it won't only be Central Americans moving north. It might be people from Oklahoma and Texas and Arizona and everything kind of moving into Montana and moving north. So those are concerns. I mean, obviously, bears and humans have issues when they live close to each other, and we're dealing with that now.
Mm-hmm.
All over. I mean, that's kind of almost a new challenge, a new paradigm on grizzly bear management is coexistence at the finer scales. I mean, it was fine in the old days when we were coexisting with grizzly bears because they were in the mountains and we were in the valleys. Simplified way to look at it. But now that they're in the valleys and we're in the mountains as well, we have a lot of more management challenges in front of us, and we're dealing with them. You're dealing with them quite well in the U.S., and we're starting to in BC, but we're not there. So I think the future's reasonably good, largely because the grizzly is a very smart animal and very, very adaptable. I mean, this brown bear, Ursus arctos, is found from the Gobi Desert to the rainforests of British Columbia to the Arctic islands now. I mean, it's an adaptable organism. So it just can't take a high level of mortality. It doesn't reproduce that fast.
Right.
I mean, there's Asian animals and African large mammals that reproduce slower. But from a North American point of view, because it doesn't have its first litter until it's usually 5 to 10 years old, it doesn't reproduce that fast. So it can't take a high mortality rate. So I have optimism, but it's going to be a continued job to live and coexist with grizzlies and other species.
She'd like to share with our audience. I mean, we would call this our insight to go, and you've got this wonderful career. What your research is fascinating. I would love to see a grizzly bear in the wild from a safe distance, obviously. But just given your background, your expertise, and things you've done and seen, any final insights you'd like to share with our audience about your work?
I guess the main was it was a wonderful career. We had a wonderful time, but I was very fortunate to have a wonderful partner to share it with. I don't think I could. I know I couldn't have done it by myself. I mean, so as a broader question, I mean, this is way beyond what you're probably expecting out of me, but no matter what you end up doing in life, if you've got a really good partner that you get along with and see eye to eye with and agree on not everything, but most things, it sure makes your ability to get stuff done better. You've got backup and friendship throughout 40 or 50 years of this. So that enabled me to do a long-term project. But also is that grizzlies live in amazing country, and when you get the amazing country with the big animals together, it's a heritage that we can't jeopardize. It is so valuable to our enjoyment and our just ability to feel good about where we live, that we should always be cautious that we can destroy that if we're not careful. And I'm optimistic that most people will value wild places, wild animals enough that we'll keep enough of it around for generations and generations. I hope so.
Very good. I think we just ended on a perfect note. So, Bruce, it's been a pleasure to have you on the podcast, and we're literally well past 50 minutes now.
Okay.
And so it went by quick. I don't know how you feel, but this was a great interview, and I appreciate your time joining us today. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I enjoyed it. That was fun. Actually, you're a good interviewer. Very pleasant. No ripping, nasty questions trying to push me somewhere or another. So that's good.
No, I appreciate that. It's all about curiosity, and so I've got some other things I wish I had asked, but it's just I'm just excited to dive more into the book, and just the confluence of science and just living your life. It's wonderful. And listen, we're going to do a quick close, and but stay on the line so you and I can have a final chat. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Thank you again. All right, folks, we've just been chatting with Bruce McLellan. He is an author and retired grizzly bear research scientist. He's also the author of The Grizzly Bear Science and the Art of a Wilderness Life, 40 Years of Research in the Flathead Valley. And I mean, we had a really broad, expansive conversation today. Just how do you unpack 40 some years of work and of adventure with his spouse, and now kids who have followed in dad's foot track, so to speak, mom's foot track, so to speak, because there was that connection there, which I appreciated, which was the fascination with just observing these animals, the grizzly bear. And I don't know about you, but I want to get past the zoo and go out into the wilderness and see a grizzly bear. So that's now on my bucket list. Listen, we're going to provide a backlink to where you can pick up your copy of Grizzly Bear Science and the Art of a Wilderness Life. Those will be in our show notes. Bruce also shared a couple of articles related to this body of work that he's doing. And we're also going to have a nice list of some of the thought leaders or researchers in the field of grizzly bear research. And we'll do our best to get some links to those resources via Bruce or some of our Google searches. Now, as for this episode, you can find us on our website, outdooradventureseries.com. We're also on LinkedIn and Facebook on our Outdoor Adventure Series pages. And you can find a short video segment up on our YouTube channel. And of course, the full episode will be available wherever you listen to your podcast. Okay. And so if you do get out by the way, to Apple Podcast or to Spotify, or even on our website, do leave some comments, some reviews. We love 5-star reviews. And also, just given the nature of this episode, please share it with your family and friends, anybody that you think would be interested in learning more about this wonderful apex predator of this grizzly bear, and just a fascinating animal. And I think you're going to really enjoy this episode. And of course, you're going to enjoy the book. Okay, folks, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, go out there, have a phenomenal day. And we will see you on a future episode of the Outdoor Adventure Series podcast. Take care now.